Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome to another Tabadlab Live. These are conversations that we have with experts who can help us understand the world a little better. And usually it's a specific topic because the person that comes in is an expert or a practitioner or a scholar in one area. But I'm very lucky, we're very lucky today that we have with us the Chief Knowledge Officer of Ipsos. This is the global polling and I guess information science behemoth. And Simon Atkinson is visiting Pakistan and has been kind enough to spend an afternoon with us. And the entry point, Simon, for this conversation is that, I mean, of course you're an expert in collecting and processing information about the way the world is. And of course, folks that are watching this are most likely either already aware of what Ipsos is or they can look it up. But Ipsos is one of the big names globally in opinion polling and I guess information science. And there's, the other big ones I guess would be Pew and Nielsen and perhaps Gallup. I want to, as the Chief Knowledge Officer, in some ways you must also have some duty of care type responsibilities about the industry at large. I want to talk to you about why you're in Pakistan and why I opened with the intro of you being, you not being here today because of expertise in one specific thing. That's the big sort of grand global survey that you do, and you've just completed one, and there's some really interesting, I guess, data that's coming out of that, but also perhaps some insights for us to help understand the world a little bit better. But talk to me a little bit about the industry at large and how you feel about maybe the diminishing trust that folks have in polls. So every time I talk to someone about the US election, they say, oh, don't worry about the polls are wrong. I didn't grow up like that. It used to be that you looked at the polls and you were like, okay, so it must be like that. What happened?
Well, at least two things happened. One of them is that polls are no longer scarce. So there's suddenly this plethora of them for everyone to choose and to look from. Now, that could be seen as a good thing, of course, that we have more and more things to look at. But it perhaps means they've been devalued in some sense because there's always some out there that you could draw on if you were, let's say, of a partisan bent. I guess that's one thing that's happened. Another thing is that we do know that the polls haven't always been accurate, and that's in more than one market. Now, their international reputation isn't too bad if you're a statistician, but if you're a politician, you can point to certain things, and particularly politicians of the right can point to repeated failures of the polls in more than one country to get it right on the day. So that's some of what we're seeing in the States, as well as the fact that it's very, very close.
Yeah, for sure. I think it is getting close. That kind of, what's happening in the US, of course, is a big deal. Whatever happens, it'll be fascinating to watch how that plays out. But in the run-up, there's two or three big global themes. And so I wonder if you just want to talk about this grand exercise. I think you do 50 countries and you do 50,000 people. And so this is kind of a state of the world, like it's almost a temperature check. What is the thermometer telling us about what are the big issues and how people feel about them?
So what we're trying to do, almost pause and take time out and just look at this in one block. So it's something we've done for our clients and colleagues and stakeholders and friends like you around the world, really. We do it every 1 or 2 years, and it's now a decade old. And some of the big things I think we're pointing out this year is it doesn't feel that optimistic when you look across all of the countries. Some of the themes we've drawn out do have, if not alarming titles, ones that make us think, like, globalization fractures or splintered societies. And some climate convergence, but even when it comes to convergence in terms of understanding on climate change, you've then got a divergence on what to do about it and all of that. So it feels a bit more somber than 10 years ago when our title was Navigating the New. Now our title is In Search of a New Consensus. And it's sometimes interesting to look at the words we used then and the words we use now.
On that, I mean, if we do, I understand strategic communications is of great interest to me, and one has tried to sort of dabble in it and at least claim some expertise over the years. But the older one gets, I think the more humble you get about what you can affect. And I'm not sure it's just age that has everything to do with it. I think that the mode of production of knowledge and information has really dramatically changed. Is that, at least in part, is it technology and social media and this kind of voice-giving thing that has happened? How much of that is showing up in your results? And
No, it's a very good point, because you know, in that 10 years since we started doing the study, internet penetration's gone around the world from something like 1/3 to 2/3. So yes, a lot of people 10 years ago were saying, I'm always looking at screens these days, but yes, there's twice as many doing them now, and the computers are much, you know, more powerful, including the ones we're carrying around with us. So I think we are seeing some of that, in particular with the fragmentation of the media. And I think we are seeing that also with social media as well. And so one of the questions we never used to ask 10 years ago was, where do you get your news from? What's the main source you use? Maybe we were asleep 10 years ago, but we're awake now, and that is one of the key questions.
And where are people getting their news from?
Well, it depends a bit, but it's kind of sort of 50-50, depending on who you're talking about. You're getting a lot of...
So traditional media still has a bit of a foothold?
It still has a bit of a foothold.
It hasn't been wiped out totally?
No, and particularly because traditional media also features on social media as well. So it's still, I think, just because people may not be having physical newspapers all of the time, I think there is still that influence there. But I think, let's say the straightforward, almost semi-blanket broadcast that traditional media could do, I think is a bit more variegated now.
One of the ways in which people define sovereignty is a monopoly over the use of force. I think that, you know, one of the things that a lot of us were not so awake to in our generation, Simon, is perhaps that the other thing about sovereignty was that it was also about a monopoly over the sources of information. Yeah. And broadly, states had a virtual monopoly. You would always have something, you know, from the side, a sidewinder, you know, an anti-establishment moment. Somehow the Iran-Contra got leaked. Yeah. And so, you know, that weakened, you know, what Reagan had to say. A few things got leaked, you know, when Thatcher was, you know, Iron Lady and was running your country. But broadly, states and especially elites in countries could decide how the place was going to be run, and it would broadly be run like that. In your sort of study this year, what are you learning about how that might have changed in 2024?
Well, I think we're seeing distrust of elites. That's not necessarily a new thing, actually, by the way, because politicians have always been at the bottom of the league table. So that's not changed on that level. We're seeing social media influencers is a bad brand. So if any of your viewers are a social media influencer, they might give themselves a different title, because the idea is bad when people hear about that. So we are seeing, I think the distrust of elites is definitely a theme there. One opportunity that's there is those of us in the business community. There is a kind of interest, and almost like, well, more than an interest, a request for businesses to do the right thing, to play their role in society. And I don't just mean the environment, actually there is to almost be, and I don't necessarily mean in a completely paternalistic way either, but business leaders traditionally, in most markets, are having a better reputation than the politicians, including here in Pakistan.
That to me is fascinating, and I think it maybe also, when one expresses fascination with that, I think we're also dating ourselves. I don't mean dating as in going out with ourselves, dating ourselves as in showing how old we are. Because there's increasing evidence from, I mean, I was just at a conference where one of the kind of top advisors to a bunch of Fortune 500 companies said that what she finds increasingly is that the more that a business leader is open to being engaged with the consumer, and being transparent about, you know, why and how companies work, the greater the brand trust is. And I just find fascinating that anybody would trust any business, given that the function of a business is to make money and not to make your life better. And so clearly that is a dated concept, and there is an association of net goodwill and positive vibes that we associate with business leaders? I
think there is a broad consensus that people expect businesses to make money, so long as they don't cross the line and people start to see the net bad things that they might be doing. And this is one of the things that we always have to ask ourselves, if we're in the business of asking questions, is to remember that people aren't always paying that much attention as well. So I think business leaders, there's sort of a famous ones, I think there's only ever going to be a certain number who are that well known. It may be that if you're a business brand, it's more about you showing leadership than showing your leader, or even good citizenship, actually, rather than the leader being the good citizen.
Is any of this coming out of like on the tail end of kind of the Me Too movement, and in particular in the UK, I guess we had BP as kind of the poster child for this, you know, very negative set of stories associated with business leaders. How much of that do you think has played into this? Because this is a surprising one for me. This wasn't part of the plan of, you know, what we were going to talk about, but I do find it fascinating because it does align with other things that one hears about the way in which CEOs of especially larger companies, how and where they position themselves.
Yeah. And one of the I would say one of the stories of this year, we talked about the US earlier, is around, or the business stories of this year, I should say, is around ESG and in particular about whether that is a tarnished brand in the sense that you should be as an organisation doing the right thing by, you know, environment, social and governance. And in the US, of course, there's been a little bit of a backlash. And I think that's the main place we've seen a backlash in terms of some of these terms about companies being seen as being woke and all of those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think the pushback in the US is more DEI focused than it is ESG. Is that right? Or?
Yes, exactly. I think DEI is a particularly challenged phrase, but that's part of, I guess if you're being a business school, that's part of the ESG agenda, and that's been particularly challenged. So that's very much, I think, on the front line of particularly US-based companies about thinking about their own market and thinking about how they communicate and all of that. So that's certainly something we've seen in the last year. I would say a bit less in Europe. Yeah.
Fantastic. Let's switch a little bit to Pakistan. What parts of the survey does Pakistan kind of appear in where it really pops up? I mean, it's 50 countries, so you would expect Pakistan to kind of be one of 50 countries, but from what I've seen, there's a couple of places where Pakistan is really at the top of the list. To explain that and tell us which areas those are.
Yeah, so I think particularly on tradition and on nostalgia. So this sense that I'd like the country to be how it used to be, and I'd like the country to be how it was when my parents were growing up. So we deliberately did two different questions there, and so Pakistan, along with Egypt and India, is indexing quite high as double nostalgic. So that's one, and then the other is perhaps connected though, is around what you might call a more traditional outlook, but certainly the view, the role of women is to be good wives and mothers, is indexing top in Pakistan, well above other countries.
And what other countries are topping in that? Like what are Pakistan's peer countries on the women and girls
Well, actually, some of them are actually in Eastern Europe. So there are some who are more Muslim countries, but in Eastern Europe there's some indexing quite high as well. Less so in places like the US. But you do stand out. It's certainly not that all the Muslim majority countries, for example, are at one end of the spectrum.
And one other area that I think Pakistan topped out on was a sense of responsibility for the other. Is that right?
Yes, that we need to look at, first and foremost, we need to look after ourselves and look after each other. That comes through very, very strongly as well.
So a sense of community and
a sense of community.
Maybe generosity? Or?
Yeah, and that also comes out a little bit on, questions around how optimistic you feel. They're always difficult because they're a little bit in the eye of the beholder, but certainly optimism and warmth around my family, my community, and my country is a little bit higher in Pakistan.
And this data was collected within the last 2 years?
Yeah.
So that's surprising. And I think I always love to be surprised, because I think the other thing, I'm sure you get this a lot, is that a lot of us are totally self-curated in our bubbles.
Yes.
And so it's like, oh man, Pakistan's been going through a poly crisis. The interest rates and inflation is off the charts, and those are all true, and that has affected people. But I always find it refreshing to kind of have a counterintuitive sort of point that shows up. So that clearly, that might be a reason to be optimistic, is if you have a country with a huge young population, and everybody doesn't feel like we're off the cliff and that it's the end of days. And in fact, there's Pakistan is showing up very high in that list of optimism. That might be something good. What do these surveys mean? Like from 10 years ago, if you were to sit back and say, we saw this thing in this society, and look how it turned out. I mean, I'm particularly interested actually in, sorry, this is a bit, I'm cheating a little bit, but I'm very interested in what the data that you had on Saudi Arabia showed for Saudi Arabia 10 years ago. Yeah. 10 years ago was 2014. You have the big Vision 2030 changes coming in 2016. You have, at least to my, to bare naked eyesight, and to the touch. I mean, you go to Saudi Arabia today, it's completely transformed from 10 years ago. Do you have any kind of examples of where you saw things and they've come to fruition and that you had maybe not called it or predicted it, but you saw data that certainly aligns with how things have turned out?
Yeah. Yes, we've been looking at this a little bit, and because of course we're very careful to say these aren't predictions, but we were looking at what we did say 10 years ago, and so the disaggregation, if I can call it that, of the communication sphere was something we were talking about in 2014. Look out for more short form, direct advertising, things like that. Climate change, we were observing how that was, let's say, climate change skepticism was starting to struggle to be, in terms of whether climate change is happening, that was on the wane. One thing we didn't, how should I put it, we were perhaps a little bit over-optimistic about politicians, because we could see some of this sense that all is not right in my country, the politicians are not doing as they should, and the society is broken. And we've still got society is broken and my country's going in the wrong direction. And I think we wrote something which in retrospect was a bit optimistic, which was, we didn't quite say we trust politicians to sort it out, but we did say it's over to leaders to diagnose this, and I think that's...
I mean, Simon, on that...
We were too optimistic 10 years ago.
I think we all have to wear that one. I think, my own sort of, until August this year, I'd been writing a column regularly for a long time, for 15 plus years. And I think this faith that give the politicians time, give these systems time, and their work, actually, that hasn't panned out. It certainly has not panned out in Pakistan. I don't know what that means, though. I mean, in the UK, maybe you're less privileged because you don't have the option of calling on the army. You'll have to figure something else out. In Pakistan, we can always, for better or worse, I think mostly for worse, we assume that somehow the army is going to be better at the thing that the people who are supposed to be good at it aren't doing. And of course, it hasn't actually worked out that way, despite multiple experiments. Are you seeing, what's the trend on democracy globally that you're seeing?
Well, it's pretty depressing, really, because like on something like democracy, elections in my country are run in a free and fair way. I mean,
is it a secular decline over 10 years?
Well, actually, it's only one we just started to ask within the last 10 years because it's a new one. But I mean, you would think that somewhere like Sweden, which is sort of celebrated as perhaps the epitome of
a place that works.
A place that works,
yeah.
Exactly. But you still got like 20 to 30% are saying no, elections aren't free and fair, and that is a little bit of a marker, really, that this sort of sense that something's been hidden from us, or you can't trust a level playing field to be in existence. And I think that's been quite a striking thing. Yeah.
So I was struck by one of the, I mean, of course, the whole document is fascinating, and we'll put up the link in the YouTube description that folks can click on, and on LinkedIn as well. I do think it's worth reading for whatever it's worth. It's just great insight. But one page that really got to me was this human values page. I wonder if I could ask somebody on our team to kind of throw that up on the screen. And there's kind of, I mean, I have questions about every single line here, right? But I think it's the top and the bottom and the middle that really kind of stick out. On the top, and this has to do with what you just talked about. Like, even in a place like Sweden, people are like, oh, like, my God, what's going to happen? And that's not me talking about Sweden. It's Swedish people talking about Sweden, right? And it's like, well, that's weird, because shouldn't you guys be happy? And I think that without any data, if you ask me to give one kind of easy, maybe lazy explanation, it would be that I think that technology, and in particular social media, have curated this weird Aristotelian sort of like agency for everyone. Yeah. So, you know, the philosophy professor at Oxford thinks he's Aristotle, and he might be, but the garbage truck driver also thinks he's Aristotle. And the weird thing is, and this is not me being woke, I mean, it's entirely possible that intellectually he's capable of that. And so you, at a moral sort of or normative frame, you don't want to dismiss the value of any individual's voice, but surely, you know, 9 billion people all can't be Aristotle, and yet everybody has this agency, this enhanced agency that social media and technology has given all of us. And is that what's creating the skepticism? Like, I'm trying to make a link between the example of Sweden and what you're talking about human values is, I have another question about whether that can bring us together. Yeah. But first, just to ask a little bit about, is there any data or evidence to connect this greater skepticism about democracy and about trust in each other, the lack of trust, is that coming from just more people having more voice?
Yeah, well, I think one of the interesting things is it's a classic one of correlation and causation, because we can point to a lot of correlations, and I'll probably sort of do that now, actually, in the sense that you can certainly do a correlation with that, and I think certain politicians saying, actually, it's fine to challenge all of these things, because if perhaps the window of what politicians in many countries were saying might have been like that previously, now it's fine, including Donald Trump in the US. He's saying it is fine to say that elections are unfair. I mean, that's kind of what he's saying. I think a certain period of time ago, many countries, let's just say there was a less of a range being put out there. I think that's one thing. To your point about the taxi driver, I guess we're all, can be seen as a good thing as well. We're all, to a greater or lesser extent, may feel that we can express our views and even publish our views, and I think that's something as well. So I think those are definitely two things. And we're a French company, and one of the words my French colleagues often use, and gets me back to my science lessons at school, is equilibrium. And it's kind of this sense, I think, for many people, this sense that things are in a nice balance. And I think for many people, whether in Sweden or Pakistan or the US, it feels like when things are out of balance, they're not as they should be. And I think that's why often, you know, we might be answering yes to the question of, would you like things to go back to when your parents were kids? You know, actually, do we though? You know, but there's that kind of sense where things aren't quite as they should be. Maybe I look back to, maybe look forward, but I look back to reference why things are bad now.
Yeah. So, Simon, you know, on this human values sort of impact on human values, the thing that unites people, in a sense, the data is saying, I know you're not saying it, but I found it counterintuitive, the whole thing. Like at the top, you have things that I think are dividing people, this kind of tech agency or social media enabled agency. I'm attributing it to social media, it could be other factors, but there's certainly more agency and voice today than there ever was before. And in a sense, is this an insight that you've derived, or is it your respondents who are saying that this is what unites us? Because to me, this is the single most divisive thing in the world today.
Yeah, this is more our observations during the analysis, is that these seems to be ones where there's more similarities and more people having similar kinds of views when we look at it back at the office, rather than asking people. Yeah.
Okay, but and what you're saying when you say unites us is these are the things countries have in common?
Yes.
Is that what you're saying, or is it that you're saying that people come together because of this?
No, it's more, these are things where we're seeing more consistency by countries.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense, because where we're divided, or the things that do not unite us, I think equity is at the bottom, right? It's the thing that I guess is the most varied across countries as a value.
Yeah, absolutely. This sense of equality, inequality, and how I feel about my place in it, and it comes up in different places with different sort of red lights flashing. But yeah, that's certainly something. I mean, inequality. It's a topic which perhaps in our other research we perhaps need to look at some more, because it always comes up spontaneously as one of the issues facing your country, whether it's a rich or poor country, wherever it is in the world. Inequality and poverty, as defined by the respondent, is always in the top three.
And yet, in this, the aggregation of the data suggests that people feel differently about this in different countries. Is that right?
When they look at it from their end, then there's a lot of sense that I'm discriminated against because of my gender or my ethnicity or who I am or my class and all of that. So once you kind of start to ask about you, I think people come back to this point about perhaps people feeling things aren't quite as they should be. We're a bit out of equilibrium. Society isn't functioning as I would like it to be.
Okay, so it's the lack of equality is causing people to feel disconnected from each other. The two things right in the middle are of particular interest to me. I think they'd be of interest to a lot of folks in Pakistan. One is anti-establishment, and the one right below that is national pride. Is that like? It seems almost counterintuitive that kind of a sense of kind of national togetherness and harmony being one thing, and being anti-establishment being another. Is it the case that these two are vectors that are in the opposite direction everywhere, or is that a uniquely Pakistani thing?
No, I think national pride we are finding in most countries. There's still quite a lot. I think the brand of my country is still something that's still quite important to me. And one of the tensions we're trying to explore here is on the globalization point. On the one hand, it's fractured because we're seeing all of these concerns around the world, and there's more wars and more divisions within countries. But the questions on globalization being good for my country, that's sort of still there. So we're still trying to get the balance right in terms of understanding, the extent to which, for example, if you're a brand, you go for we are a national brand, we are about you, the people of this country, or whether they're being more expansive and trying to look overseas. So that kind of global versus national kind of dynamic is something that's
the logic behind kind of the construction of the question and the analysis.
Yes, and one of the things the phrase we use is called cognitive polyphasia, this ability to think the same and say conflicting things at the same time, and often that's what we're getting from our surveys and our respondents and in ourselves. Globalization is on balance a force for good because we love the interconnected world and all these things that trade brings us and all of the medical improvements that helped us get out of COVID.
But I really hate all these immigrants that have moved into my neighborhood.
Yes, or I don't like these American brands because of what they're doing in Israel or whatever it might be. Yeah. So I think we can logically say I hold both views and I'm not being contradictory. They are perfectly fair. But that's perhaps a risk if you're trying to generalize, you have to acknowledge that some of the next level down might get a bit more complicated.
I think that's also, I think the internationalist / globalist types, broadly, I think you and I would both belong in those categories. I think we have a lot of preconceived notions about what belongs in what box. Yeah. And I think oftentimes we're trying to help fix other people's perspective, but I think one of the things a lot of data and insight gives us is a chance to maybe look inside a little bit and think about how we're framing boxes. That's why I found the anti-establishment one being next to the national pride one really interesting. I mean, it's entirely possible to be supremely proud of the country that you're in, for that to be a kind of brand value that you would respond to positively, and also see yourself as an anti-establishment sort of person who isn't down with the elite and who's, who wants to break the mold and change things. That those things are not contradictory.
No, absolutely. Definitely we're seeing that among many people in this study, for sure.
And I think that's where these kinds of studies are really important in terms of opening up our minds and challenging us to think more openly.
That's right. They're genuinely, this is not one when we're saying, these are the 5 key findings and this is what you should do. We do those studies. This is not one of them. It's much more.
You charge a lot of money for those studies, so you're not going to give me any of those insights.
No, I think we're more saying, have a look at this. Have a look. These are the questions that we think it raises, and elements of it we can then use in whatever our work is to perhaps help us think through things from 1 or 2 different angles.
Listen, Simon, I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you for having me.
I'll even enjoy more a chance to really dig deeper into the data and look at that, and of course, hopefully give folks that are watching a chance to meet you again very soon. But thank you for this, and like I said, we'll share the information on how to get to this document and read it, and choose for yourself what parts of it make sense for you and how those insights can help you either as a business person or as a student or as somebody who's interested in thinking about the world in a way that's more informed. Simon, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Thank you. Khuda Hafiz.